Thanks, John, and thanks to all of you for still being here at the end of a long and very exciting day. And it's a relief to see Becky stepping up to the front there. We're very excited that mental health has been included in the BRC. It's a really exciting time for mental health research in the UK in general, I think, as there's growing appreciation of growing concerns about population mental health. In our team, the theme is jointly led by myself and Stan Zammit. We've got a mixed group of researchers with backgrounds in psychiatry, public health, experimental psychology, as you heard already, primary care, and I think that's it actually, and a strong group of co-investigators. And you've heard already today from our stellar PhD students who are studying a range of areas to support this theme. It's probably worth just rehearsing to this audience, reminding us why mental health is so important. In England, in any given year, 1 in 6 adults will suffer from a common mental health problem. And across the globe, mental health and substance misuse disorders are the leading causes of disability and likely to become growing contributors to population morbidity in years to come. 800,000 people die each year as a result of suicide. That's 1 every 40 seconds, and about 5% of adults in this country will attempt suicide at some time. Importantly, in terms of the work within this theme, about half of all mental disorders begin in childhood and adolescence, and a lot of the research within the theme is focused on Ausbach-based studies, which are ideal for looking at this period of the life course. Within the theme, our aim is to use expertise amongst our group in causal analyses, capitalise on the existing randomised trials we have, as well as the population cohorts and clinical networks, to identify promising targets for clinical or policy interventions. Our work's divided into 3 work streams around biomarkers, causal analysis, and experimental medicine. I'll just illustrate each of those very briefly before handing over to Becky. So, as an example of our biomarkers work, we're building on Nicola Wiles and David Kessler's NIHR program of work around the use of CBT for depression to incorporate within this trial MRI brain scanning of individuals who are randomised to take part in the trial. We know that CBT is an effective treatment for depression, but we've got relatively limited evidence about the factors that affect treatment response. Research suggests that neuroimaging changes may predict treatment response, and we're going to be using BRC funding to combine within this trial MRI scans with evidence of effectiveness by carrying out a mechanistic study nested within David and Nicola's trial. And the potential impact of this work is better targeted interventions for people with depression. In terms of our causal analysis work stream, we're using work alongside George's theme to identify promising targets for treatments. You've heard already about the emotional recognition work. Other areas we'll be looking at using Mendelian randomization approaches to identify targets in relation to alcohol, cigarette smoking, and possible dietary targets as well. And then lastly, in our experimental work stream, we're undertaking a number of feasibility studies, a mindfulness-based intervention for the treatment of domestic violence and post-traumatic stress disorder associated with that, trauma-focused psychological therapy for preventing the onset of psychosis in those at high risk, and using choice architecture interventions around glass shape aimed at reducing alcohol consumption, building on Marcus's work showing that the shape of your glass when you drink a pint of beer in the pub influences how much you end up drinking. Our overall aim is to increase knowledge about the prevention and treatment of mental health problems, to make a difference for service users, their families, clinicians, and wider society, and to build the capacity for the next generation of researchers in mental health. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Becky Mars, one of our 2 researchers in post. She's only been in research in post about 6 months or so, and she's going to talk about her work.
Great, thank you very much, David. So my name's Becky, and I'm going to talk about some work that we've been doing looking at the transitions from suicidal thoughts to suicide attempts. So for those of you who may not be familiar with self-harm, I'm just going to start off with a definition. So self-harm refers to non-fatal self-poisoning or self-injury, irrespective of suicidal intent. It includes a wide variety of behaviours, for example, overdoses, self-cutting, hanging, and jumping. And self-harm is a major public health issue. It accounts for over 200,000 hospital admissions every year. But we also know from community studies that the true prevalence of self-harm is much greater than this, as the majority of episodes don't present to services. Self-harm is particularly common amongst young people, so our data from the ASBAC birth cohort, which I'm going to talk more about later, suggests that by the age of 16, nearly 1 in 5 young people will have self-harmed on at least one occasion. And alarmingly, recent figures also suggest that the incidence of self-harm is rising, particularly amongst young women. Self-harm not only causes distress and harm for the individual, but it's also the strongest known risk factor for later suicide. And this is one of the leading causes of death in young people. And some of my earlier work has shown that if a young person self-harms in adolescence, they're more likely to suffer from a range of adverse consequences in early adulthood, including mental health problems, substance use problems, and educational and occupational difficulties. So it's a really important issue. Suicidal thoughts are also very common amongst young people, but thankfully, most of the people who think about suicide will not go on to act on their thoughts. So only around 1 in 3 people who think about suicide will make an attempt during their lifetime. And while we know an awful lot about the different risk factors that are associated with suicide, surprisingly, most of these risk factors are actually very poor at identifying which young people with suicidal thoughts will go on to make an attempt in the future. And this information is clearly very important for suicide prevention. So, for example, in the WHO World Mental Health Surveys, known risk factors accounted for a large proportion of the variance in predicting suicidal thoughts. So these are things like socio-demographic factors and psychiatric disorders. But these same risk factors were very poor at predicting suicide attempts amongst those who were experiencing suicidal thoughts. And in a recent meta-analysis by May and Klonsky, they looked at 12 different variables which have been shown to be associated with suicidal behaviour and found that all of these had negligible to moderate effects at being able to distinguish between those with suicidal thoughts and those with suicide attempts. So some of the recent theoretical models of suicide, I'm not going to go into these in detail, they're just going to name them for you. So there's the interpersonal theory, the three-step theory, and the integrated motivational volitional model. These all fit within what we call an ideation to action framework. And this framework basically suggests that the development of suicidal thoughts and the progression from suicidal thoughts to attempts are distinct processes with separate risk factors and explanations. However, the research that's been conducted in this area to date has suffered from a number of important limitations. So the first of all is that most research has been cross-sectional. So each of the 27 studies that were included in that meta-analysis were all cross-sectional, which means they were conducted at a single snap point in time. And it's not clear how much factors identified in these studies actually will predict the occurrence of future suicide attempts, which is what we ultimately want to be able to do. And also, there are very few studies which have been conducted in adolescents. Again, none of the studies in that meta-analysis included young people. And again, this is really important. As I've shown, it's a really important issue amongst young people. And also, this is the age at which the incidence of suicidal thoughts and attempts is highest. So with that in mind, we wanted to investigate the factors that predict the transition between suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts over time, using data collected at age 16 and age 21. And this sort of research is nearing completion now, and I'm going to go through the methodology and the results with you during this talk. And then future work that we're doing, we're going to use newly collected data and hopefully focus more on factors that might be particularly relevant for intervention development. So we've used data from a population-based birth cohort study called the Avon Longitudinal Study of Parents and Children, You have heard about this, I'm sure, in earlier talks today, so I'm just going to go through it very briefly. The study involves 14,000 mothers who were recruited during pregnancy, and the parents and children have been followed up regularly since birth. They take part in research clinics and also complete self-report questionnaires. And the children are now in their mid-20s. Oh, sorry, this slide is a little bit blurry, but it just shows the different data points at which self-harm has been collected in ASBAC. So starting off from the earliest time point at age 11, we've also got data at age 15, 16, 18, 21, age 24, and now we're currently collecting data at age 25. And this makes ASBAC a really, really unique study. And importantly, these repeated measurements means that we can explore how these things change over time, which is something that many studies have just not been able to do. Another major strength of the ASBAC study is the breadth of data that we have available. So this has enabled us to look at a wide variety of different risk factors for suicidal behaviour. So we included demographic variables, a range of sociological and behavioural variables, and also psychiatric and mental health variables. And these were chosen based on the prior literature, and also where possible, we wanted to test out ones which were relevant for those theoretical models. So at age 16, we had just under 5,000 data from just under 5,000 young people. The vast majority of young people reported no suicidal thoughts or attempts at age 16. Around 10% reported experiencing suicidal thoughts but had never made a suicide attempt. And around 7% of our sample had attempted suicide on at least one occasion. So the data that I'm going to present today focuses on this red wedge here. So young people who had thought about suicide at age 16 but had not yet made a suicide attempt. And our overarching research question is, can we predict which young people in this red wedge will go on to make a suicide attempt over the next 5 years? So we had 310 young people who had suicidal reports at 16 and also provided us with data at 21. And of those, 38 went on to make a suicide attempt over that 5-year follow-up, which is 12% of the sample. So 310 might sound like a very small number to you, especially in the context of some of the figures we've been hearing today. But I just want to highlight that this is the largest study of its kind that's been conducted to date. So the vast majority of research in this field has been cross-sectional. So longitudinal studies like this, which incorporate more than one time point, are extremely rare. And also, because it's the last talk of the day, I didn't want to go putting up tables of odds ratios, start sending you all to sleep. So I'm not going to present the findings for all of the different risk factors. I'm just going to present the ones where we found the strongest associations. So we found associations for exposure to self-harm in a family member, which was associated with about a 2.5-fold increased risk of suicide attempts. Also substance use, particularly cannabis use and illicit drug use, which are associated with between a 3- and 4-fold increased risk. And also non-suicidal self-harm, which is harming yourself without suicidal intent, particularly if frequent. So young people who at 16 years had harmed themselves 6 or more times in the previous year were over 5 times more likely to attempt suicide over the follow-up. Most of the factors that we looked at did not predict attempts amongst those with suicidal thoughts or had very small effects. So even things like depression symptoms and psychiatric disorder, which are really well-established, robust risk factors for suicide, did not predict attempts in this sample. And I'm sure a lot of you in the audience are going to find that very surprising, but these findings are consistent with the literature. And again, they support this ideation to action framework. And they suggest that factors such as depression symptoms and psychiatric disorders are really important in the development of suicidal thoughts, but that different factors seem to be involved in progression from thoughts to attempts. So the factors we did identify, so non-suicidal self-harm, exposure to self-harm in other people, and substance use, are really interesting because each of these factors has been related to the concept of suicide capability. So, for example, non-suicidal self-harm is thought to increase suicide capability as, through repeated episodes of non-suicidal self-harm, a young person becomes habituated to pain and fear, which is needed to carry out a suicidal act. The concept of suicide capability is also a key feature in each of those 3 suicidal theories, and so our findings from this study are consistent with current thinking. And it's possible that these risk factors could be incorporated into risk assessments for young people who come experiencing suicidal thoughts to help identify which of them might be most at risk of attempting suicide in the future. Okay, so I've just focused there on some research that we've been doing to date. I'm going to finish with a brief slide highlighting some areas that we'd like to look at in the future. So this work is going to involve new data collection. So as I said earlier, this is currently ongoing now in the young people at age 25, 26. And we want to build on the work that we've done so far. So we've identified exposure to self-harm in family members and substance use as particularly important factors in the transitions from thoughts to attempts. So we want to look at these factors in more detail and find out why are these factors associated with that transition, and what can we learn about them that might be important for informing interventions in this area. We also plan to look at emotion recognition, which we've heard about a little bit this afternoon, both from Steph and Jenny. So we know that emotion recognition is disrupted in people with depression, and there's some evidence to suggest as well that that might be the case for people with self-harm. So we'd like to have a look at that in more detail in our sample, and then with a view to the fact that that could potentially then inform intervention based around emotion recognition. Okay, so I'd just like to finish up by thanking my collaborators for this project. So at the University of Bristol, we've got David, John, Kate and Paul, and also collaborators from the University of Glasgow, University of British Columbia and University of Cambridge. Thank you very much.